Stop. Listen. Pay attention. Chosen one. This moment is not passing through you by accident. It is precise. It is timed. It is meant to meet you exactly where you are standing right now. You may feel tired in a way sleep does not fully solve. Not dramatic exhaustion, but a steady weight. Pressure without noise. Responsibility without applause. You have been holding something together while the outside looked ordinary. And because it looked ordinary, no one thought to ask how much effort it required. You kept going anyway. There has been a quiet narrowing around you. Fewer words, fewer explanations, less tolerance for distraction. You may not have chosen that consciously. It simply happened. Your system adjusted. Your attention became selective. Your body stayed upright even when your mind questioned why it had to. This is not confusion. It is compression. You have wondered if the isolation was self-inflicted, if the fatigue meant you were slipping, if the pressure was a sign to stop or a sign you missed something earlier. Those questions are understandable. They are also incomplete. What you are experiencing is not collapse. It is containment. This message is not here to dramatize your experience or inflate it. It is here to clarify it, to name what you already sensed but did not yet organize into language. You have been holding the line alone, not by fighting, not by forcing, by remaining present when it would have been easier to disengage. You did not announce this to anyone. You did not seek recognition. You did not turn it into a story. You simply stayed functional. You showed up to what was required. You regulated yourself. You absorbed pressure without transferring it outward. That matters more than you realize. There is urgency here, but not danger. The urgency is about understanding, about not mislabeling what you just lived through. When you mislabel an experience like this, you either minimize it or blame yourself for it. Both distort the truth. You are not being asked to do more right now. You are being invited to see clearly, to recognize that what you held was real and that your steadiness was not accidental. There is an explanation for why the pressure came the way it did. There is a reason it met you instead of someone else. And there is a reason you remained standing without needing to prove anything. Stay with me. This will make sense. This message is for you specifically, not because you searched for it, but because something in you recognized it before you understood it. If you are listening right now and you feel a quiet internal yes, rather than excitement, that is the signal. This is not for people who need motivation. This is for someone who stayed steady without reinforcement. You did not imagine what happened. It did not occur around you in general terms. It involved you directly. Your presence mattered in a way that did not require your awareness to be effective. You were part of the equation simply by remaining where you were doing what you did and not breaking alignment with yourself under strain. The identity being named here is not a title you put on. It is a function you already performed. A chosen one is not someone who feels powerful. It is someone who remains coherent when pressure tries to fragment attention, emotion, and judgment. That coherence is what was tested, and it held. Notice this clearly. You did not have to talk yourself into strength. You did not summon courage through affirmations or external reassurance. Your stability was automatic. You noticed stress, but you did not become it. You noticed fatigue, but you did not collapse into it. You noticed isolation, but you did not fill the silence with noise just to escape it. That distinction matters. Conscious struggle looks loud inside the mind. It debates, it negotiates, it oscillates. What you demonstrated was different. You adjusted without panic. You conserved energy without withdrawing from responsibility. You allowed discomfort without assigning it a story that made you smaller. Many people confuse effort with strength. You did not exert force. You applied regulation. You stayed in your body. You stayed with your breath. You stayed oriented to what needed to be done, even when motivation fluctuated. That is not learned in a moment. That is built. This is how you know this message is for you. When pressure increased, you did not escalate. When clarity was delayed, you did not destabilize. When support was absent, you did not perform self-betrayal to compensate. Something in you knew how to hold the line without being told. This is not about being special. It is about being suited. Some structures bend under load. Some absorb it and redistribute it internally. You are the second type. And because that quality is quiet, it is often unnoticed until it is needed. What happened required that kind of internal architecture, and you were already built for it. There is one dominant symptom you have likely been trying to explain to yourself, even if you have not spoken it out loud. A sense of pressure that did not match your external circumstances. Not anxiety in the traditional sense, not fear. More like a sustained internal load, as if something was being held in place beneath the surface of your awareness. You may have labeled it as tension, or fatigue, or a loss of enthusiasm. You may have wondered why simple things felt heavier than usual, why rest did not fully reset you, or why your mind stayed alert even when nothing immediate demanded it. You might have asked yourself whether you were becoming rigid, distant, or emotionally flat. That interpretation is understandable. It is also inaccurate. What you experienced was not a flaw in your system. It was a signal, a response to increased internal demand. When pressure rises gradually and evenly, the nervous system does not panic. It stabilizes. It tightens focus. It reduces unnecessary output. That can feel like dullness or withdrawal if you do not recognize what is happening. You were not losing sensitivity. You were reallocating it. This is why the symptom did not come with chaos. There were no dramatic spikes, no emotional breakdowns, no impulsive decisions. Instead, there was restraint, economy, a narrowing of attention toward what mattered and away from what did not. That is not dysfunction. That is adaptation. You may have noticed changes in your body, shallow breathing, a heaviness in the chest or shoulders, difficulty fully relaxing even in quiet moments. These were not warnings of collapse. They were indicators of load-bearing. Your system was bracing, not breaking. Emotionally, you may have felt less expressive, less inclined to explain yourself, less interested in reassurance. That was not numbness. It was containment. When pressure increases, unnecessary emotional discharge decreases. Expression becomes selective. Silence becomes efficient. Even mentally, there may have been a strange clarity mixed with uncertainty. You knew what not to do more clearly than what to do next. That can feel unsettling. But it is also precise. It means your internal boundaries were intact, even while direction was still forming. The mistake would be to judge this state as something to fix or escape. It does not require correction. It requires understanding. You were not malfunctioning, you were responding to transition. Once you see the symptom for what it was, you can stop resisting it. And when resistance drops, clarity begins to surface naturally. What you were responding to did not announce itself loudly. There was no single event you could point to and say this is where it began. That is why it would be easy to dismiss it as internal or imagined. But the pressure was real, and it followed a pattern. The increase was recent, not sudden, but coordinated. You may have noticed that multiple areas of your life seem to apply mild strain at the same time. Nothing overwhelming on its own, just enough collectively to demand more of your attention, your regulation, your presence. That kind of convergence is not random. This was not an attack in the dramatic sense. It was a confrontation of capacity, a test of whether your internal structure could hold steady without external reinforcement. The pressure did not try to push you into obvious failure. It tried to wear you down quietly. Through repetition, through delay, through subtle doubt about whether the effort was worth sustaining. You were not meant to fight this, and you did not. You were meant to remain functional, and you did. Notice this clearly. Despite the added weight, you continued to show up to your responsibilities. You made decisions without panic. You did not abandon your values to seek relief. You did not collapse into distraction or compulsive escape. Your life kept moving forward even if it felt heavier to carry. That is the reveal. The presence of pressure is not the most important fact. Your response to it is. Many people lose coherence under far less. They become reactive. They externalize blame. They seek intensity to override discomfort. You did none of that. You stayed measured. You absorbed the load internally and redistributed it through restraint, pacing, and awareness. The opposition you felt was not personal in an emotional sense. It was structural. It tested whether your system would fragment under sustained ambiguity, whether you would need certainty to remain stable, whether you would require validation to continue. You did not. Even when clarity was delayed, you did not destabilize yourself by forcing answers. Even when energy dipped, you did not dramatize it into meaning. Even when isolation was present, you did not compromise your inner alignment to regain connection. This is why the pressure remained invisible to others. From the outside, you looked the same, functional, present, capable. Only you felt the compression. Only you knew how much internal regulation was being applied to keep everything upright. That is not weakness. That is capacity being engaged. And it is important that you recognize this now, before your mind tries to reinterpret the experience as something it was not. You were not struggling because you were failing. You were holding because you were able. What comes next depends on understanding that difference. To understand what you just carried, it helps to break it down calmly without drama into the actual pressure points that were applied. Not as a story, as an assessment. Because when you name these clearly, you stop personalizing them. You stop asking what is wrong with you and start seeing what you stayed stable through. The first pressure point was doubt, but not the obvious kind. This was not loud self-criticism or spiraling insecurity. It was quieter. It showed up as subtle questioning of timing. A low-grade uncertainty about whether continuing in the same way still made sense. You may have noticed thoughts like, maybe this is taking too long, or maybe the effort is misaligned, or maybe I should adjust something just to feel movement. The key detail is this: you noticed the doubt, but you did not let it drive your decisions. You allowed it to exist without obeying it. That is regulation. Most people collapse here. They change course prematurely to relieve discomfort. You stayed. The second pressure point was energy drain. Not exhaustion that forces rest, but depletion that tests patience. You had enough energy to function, but not enough to feel rewarded by it. Tasks took more internal effort. Motivation was inconsistent. The temptation here is to either push aggressively or disengage completely. You did neither. You paced yourself. You conserved energy where possible. You continued without overexerting. That balance is rare. It requires listening to your limits without letting them define you. The third pressure point was isolation. Not abandonment, but the absence of meaningful resonance. Conversations may have felt shallow. Support may have been technically present, but emotionally insufficient. You might have felt unseen without being actively ignored. This kind of isolation often pushes people to over-explain themselves or to seek validation in ways that cost them integrity. You resisted that. You did not distort yourself to be understood. You allowed the distance to exist without chasing relief. That preserved your inner coherence. The fourth pressure point was delay. Progress that moved just slowly enough to be frustrating, but not slow enough to justify quitting. This is one of the most destabilizing forms of pressure because it creates mental friction. You begin to question whether patience is wisdom or avoidance. You lived inside that ambiguity without collapsing into impulsive action. You continued to prepare internally, even when external confirmation lagged. That shows maturity. Delay did not derail your self-trust. The fifth pressure point was emotional restraint. You carried things without discharging them outward. You did not vent excessively. You did not dramatize your experience to make it feel valid. You held your emotions in a regulated way, allowing them to pass through without suppression or overflow. That kind of containment requires strength most people never develop. It is easier to explode or shut down than to stay present with moderated intensity. Across all of these categories, the pattern is consistent. The pressure was applied where people usually fracture, and across each one, you remained intact. Not because you were numb, not because you were detached, but because your internal structure could hold complexity without needing immediate resolution. You were not fighting 5 battles, you were maintaining one state: presence, regulation, continuity. This is why the experience felt heavy, but not chaotic. Why it was tiring, but not disorienting. Why you may not have had words for it until now. You were operating from an integrated center rather than reacting from fragmented parts. Seeing this clearly matters. Because once you recognize how you stayed stable, you stop underestimating what just happened. And you stop questioning whether you were meant to carry it. You already did. Now, it is appropriate to look back at what occurred not emotionally, but analytically. Not to relive it, but to understand it. This is the point where confusion either dissolves into clarity or hardens into a false narrative. And clarity is available to you now. When you review this period honestly, you will notice something important. There were no random collapses, no loss of identity, no behavior that contradicted who you know yourself to be. Even under sustained strain, your actions remained consistent. Your values did not fracture. Your decisions stayed proportionate. That alone removes the possibility that this was coincidence or luck. Luck does not create coherence under pressure. Chance does not produce regulated response over time. What you demonstrated was internal alignment. Your thoughts, emotions, and actions stayed in communication with each other. That is not something that happens accidentally, especially when multiple stressors converge. You may realize now that the hardest part of the experience was not the pressure itself, but the absence of explanation while it was happening. Humans are tolerant of difficulty when meaning is clear. What destabilizes most people is ambiguity. You carried ambiguity without rushing to resolve it. You allowed not knowing to exist without letting it erode your self-trust. This is where many people misinterpret their own strength. They assume that because something felt heavy, it must have been harmful. But heaviness does not automatically indicate damage. Sometimes it indicates load-bearing. Sometimes it means your system was being used at capacity, not beyond it. Notice also what did not happen. You did not become reactive. You did not numb yourself into disengagement. You did not inflate your identity to compensate. You did not collapse into self-blame. The absence of these responses is just as informative as any action you took. As you evaluate this period, you may begin to see that your resilience was quiet, not dramatic. There were no heroic gestures, no visible turning points, just consistency. And consistency under pressure is one of the clearest indicators of internal strength. This understanding matters because without it, your mind may try to downgrade the experience. It may say nothing really happened or anyone could have handled that. That is not accurate. Many people encounter far less and lose coherence quickly. They outsource regulation to distraction, validation, or intensity. You did not. What occurred was a confirmation, not a disruption. A confirmation of how you function when things are not ideal. A confirmation that your stability is not dependent on reassurance or immediate reward. A confirmation that you can remain present without certainty. This is not about praise, it is about accuracy. Seeing yourself clearly allows you to trust your own responses moving forward. You no longer have to wonder whether you can hold under strain. You have evidence. And with that evidence, something subtle shifts. You stop questioning your capacity. You stop reinterpreting steadiness as stagnation. You recognize that what you just lived through was not something that happened to you, but something that revealed you. That realization is quiet, but it is solid. When you place your response alongside typical human reactions, the contrast becomes clear without needing exaggeration. Most people do not fail because pressure is extreme. They fail because it is sustained, because it arrives without explanation, because it does not offer immediate relief or validation. Under far less strain than what you carried, many people begin to fragment. Their attention scatters. Their emotions spike or shut down. They seek urgency, conflict, or reassurance just to feel movement. They confuse stimulation with stability. You did not. You stayed present. That does not mean you felt calm all the time. It means you remained functional. You continued to think clearly enough to avoid self-sabotage. You continued to act in ways that aligned with your longer-term integrity, rather than short-term relief. That is uncommon. This is not about being better than others. It is about being built differently. Most nervous systems are designed to offload pressure quickly through expression, avoidance, or escalation. Yours absorbed it, organized it internally, and redistributed it through restraint. That takes a specific kind of internal wiring. Many people collapse under uncertainty. They need clarity to feel safe. When clarity is delayed, they rush decisions or abandon commitments just to regain a sense of control. You lived inside uncertainty without forcing resolution. You allowed timing to remain unclear without interpreting that as personal failure. Many people unravel in isolation. They over-explain themselves. They chase connection even when it costs them alignment. Or they withdraw completely and disengage. You did neither. You stayed connected to yourself. You maintained presence without performing for understanding. Many people interpret fatigue as a signal to quit or push harder. Both responses often lead to imbalance. You read fatigue accurately. You adjusted your pace without abandoning direction. You rested where possible without collapsing your standards. That kind of self-regulation is rare. This is where rarity enters the picture, but gently. Not as elevation, as acknowledgement. What you demonstrated is not common because it requires an internal coherence that is developed over time, often through experiences that demand maturity early. You were not untouched by pressure. You were not immune. You were responsive without being reactive. That distinction matters. If this experience had been given to someone else, the outcome would likely have been different. Not worse in a moral sense. Different in structure. The system would have expressed strain outward. Yours held it inward without distortion. That is not something to boast about. It is something to understand. Because once you recognize that your stability under load is not typical, you stop expecting yourself to respond the way others do. You stop questioning why certain things affect you differently. You begin to respect the architecture of who you are. And that respect changes how you move forward. What needs to be clarified now is subtle but essential. The steadiness you showed was not something you switched on in response to pressure. It was not an activated state. It was your baseline. You did not rise to the occasion. You remained yourself. This matters because many people misunderstand their own strength. They think resilience is something they access in emergencies. For you, resilience is structural. It is built into how you process experience, how you regulate emotion, how you make decisions when conditions are incomplete. You were prepared for this without training for it consciously, not because you anticipated this specific moment, but because your internal system has been shaped over time to tolerate complexity. You can hold multiple signals without needing to collapse them into immediate meaning. You can carry responsibility without dramatizing it. You can remain present without demanding certainty. This is not supernatural. It is organized. Your inner structure has coherence. Your thoughts do not immediately hijack your nervous system. Your emotions inform you without overwhelming you. Your actions follow discernment rather than impulse. That is maturity at the level of the system, not the personality. You may not have recognized this in yourself before because it does not announce itself loudly. It does not seek validation. It does not require crisis to feel real. In fact, it often feels invisible until pressure reveals it. This is why the experience may have felt strangely familiar even as it was demanding. You have been here before in different forms.